Hey guys, this is Mr. Moore. I'm back for another AP European History Review session. I'm again in Unit 1 on the Renaissance and Exploration. This is a time period in European history from 1450 to 1648. And my objective here is to help you understand anything and everything I can that you might come across on the AP European History test. I hope this study guide is beneficial to you. This study guide was not made by me, but was given out by the College Board. And I took the College Board's key concept outline and I just pasted it into a readable format for my students. I highlighted the learning objectives, and when it came to the illustrative examples of the periods, I've given a little bit of my own commentary, and that's what I plan to do here today. Topic 1.9 on the slave trade is, it's one of those chapters in the history of the world that's ugly. Sometimes Americans think that slavery is like their story and their history, and it is. But it's a world history thing. It's not just something that happened in the United States. Perhaps I should start off with this visual aid right here. I'm going to take a second and make this a little bit bigger so that everybody can see it on their screen in a visual reminder right here. But this chart right here is showing us the number of African slaves that were brought to the New World, and the size of the circles is proportionate to the number of slaves that were imported. When you look at this, it gives you maybe a different perspective than you would normally or naturally have. The number of slaves that were actually brought back to Europe is pretty pathetically small. There were some slaves that were brought from Africa and served in European houses and on European farms, but not very much. The vast majority of Africans were taken across the Atlantic and used mostly in the Caribbean. These islands right here, below the United States, Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and what they call the Lesser Antilles down here. The Greater Antilles are these bigger islands, and the Lesser Antilles are these smaller islands in the Caribbean. But you can see that the vast majority of Africans were taken to the Caribbean to work on sugar plantations, coffee plantations. In the American South, on cotton and tobacco plantations. This right here, this is British North America at the time of this chart, and you can see that there are a lot of slaves that are taken to the British colonies, but nothing compares to the amount of slaves that were being taken to places like Cuba, Jamaica, and Dominica, right? Dominican Republic and Haiti and other places. And then look at this. I mean, the amount of slaves that were taken to Brazil is utterly staggering. And what that means is if you were to say, like, go on vacation to Jamaica, if you showed up on that Caribbean island, I mean, you would see a ton of, well, people who are of African descent, black people. If you went to places like Haiti and Dominican Republic, you'd see a lot of black people right there. And Brazil is a mix of people of African blood and Portuguese European blood, and of course Native Americans that were living there. Brazil is a very deep, colored, and cultured place because of that African influence. And so I thought that might be a good place to kind of start off. That this transatlantic slave issue is not just an issue in the United States, but it's a global issue. And this learning objective L for topic 1.9 says, explain the causes for and the development of the slave trade. So we always have to ask that question, why? Why were slaves being used? And why was slavery particularly coming from Africa? Has there ever been a time where white Europeans enslaved other white people? And the answer is yes. One of the things in my class I tried to do is to help people understand that slavery has existed on every continent and in every time. The Romans, who were white Europeans, used to enslave like the Greeks when they conquered them, who are white Europeans. So whites have enslaved whites. One of the other things that's ugly and not fun to talk about is when the Portuguese did show up in West Africa. It's well documented that black Africans who were already there were already having slave markets. What's going to happen with the European slave trade is a whole nother level of ugliness. But black Africans enslaved other black Africans, and Native Americans enslaved other Native Americans. A lot of people ask this question, which I think is a great question to ask. Um, when Europeans were coming over to the Americas and they were setting up like plantations and trying to extract precious metals like silver or gold out of the earth, or trying to grow cash crops like cotton, tobacco, coffee, sugar, why didn't they just use Native Americans as slaves? And the problem really comes down to Native Americans dying of slavery. No, sorry, Native Americans dying of disease. So they wanted to use them as slaves, but Native Americans died because of disease at such a high rate that they couldn't use them. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that Europeans did use natives as slaves, but they just couldn't keep up with the demand for growing these cash crops, this encomienda system, or these plantations. Plantations are giant farms that were used to make cash crops. And so that's what I wanted to point out. Why? Okay. Europeans expanded the African slave trade in response to the establishment of a plantation economy in the Americas and demographic catastrophes among indigenous peoples. Exactly what I just said, but they're using complicated words. So these Europeans were trying to grow cash crops, but because so many Native Americans, indigenous peoples, were dying of diseases, that's why they started to use Africans. So why weren't the Africans dying of these diseases? I think it should be pretty obvious if you look at it geographically that Africa, it almost touches Europe. Interaction between Europe and Africa has been going on for millennia, thousands of years, right? So even though they don't quite touch by land, I mean, by land, you could go from Morocco through Egypt, up through the Middle East, and over the Caucasus Mountains, and then into Eastern Europe by land. You really could go from Africa to Europe by land. But crossing the Mediterranean is something that's happened in all kinds of ancient cultures from Greek and Roman times and beyond. And so there's always been this trade going back and forth. And so generally, Africans are on the same immunity scale as Europeans because they've interacted so much. One thing that people talk about is this land barrier here in Africa, the Sahara Desert, which separates North and South Africa, or this sub-Saharan region. And so it does block some diseases from going down, but still there was so much intertrade between European societies and African societies that Africans were generally immune to European diseases. And so they become those people that are used in this horrific system. The illustrative examples of this period, slave trade development, there's something called the Middle Passage. That's the name given to the transportation of slaves from West Africa to the Americas. And it usually takes some 6 weeks by ship to do that. I had some slides and things that we used to show the Middle Passage and where slaves are being transported and percentages. 6% were taken to what becomes the United States. 40% taken to the Caribbean, 17 to the Spanish pieces of South America, and some 38% to what we would call Brazil today. The last thing right here on this topic of the slave trade is planter society. Plantation economies were established in the Caribbean, along with North and South America by Europeans to produce cash crops. Native Americans were used as laborers at first, but soon African slaves were brought in and exploited in catastrophically large numbers. This doesn't do it justice to talk about the slave trade in such a short stance, but it's one of the key features of exploration, one of the ugly sides, and it has long-lasting ramifications on both the Americas and European society. It's also sometimes associated with other topics that are discussed, things like triangular trade, that's discussed later on in this class, where we start talking about this interconnected connection between Europe and Africa and the Americas. This is a simple version of a much more complicated concept and idea of triangular trade. But it's really those manufactured goods coming out of Europe, slaves being taken out of Africa, brought to colonies. Both British, Spanish, French, Portuguese, all these colonies used slave labor, and slavery wasn't ended until we're talking the 1800s. So, from the beginning of during the 1400s, when this age of exploration begins, all the way until the 1800s for several hundred years, and it's shaped the destiny of countries, including the United States and the Civil War, along with other things. But that's the general premise of the slave trade. And this is Mr. Moore wrapping up topic 1.9, the slave trade.